Rude passengers disrespect fallen soldier. On board, then Barron Trump does the unexpected. Would you stay silent if a fallen soldier was disrespected, or would you rise to defend their honor? On one unforgettable flight, as tensions ran high, Barron Trump made a bold decision that stunned everyone. Disrespectful murmurs rippled through the cabin, passengers grew restless, but none of them were prepared for what Barron was about to do next. His act not only silenced the critics, but left an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. Keep watching to see how one moment of courage changed everything. It started like any other flight, passengers boarding, overhead bins closing, and seatbelts clicking into place. But everything changed when a black hearse arrived on the tarmac. A solemn honor guard draped an American flag over a casket, preparing to load it onto the plane. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a brief delay to honor a fallen soldier." Most passengers remained silent, moved by the moment, but a few weren't so respectful. "This is ridiculous," muttered a man in a suit. Another scoffed, "Why couldn't they wait till we left?" Murmurs of impatience rippled through the cabin as tension thickened. Little did anyone know, seated quietly in the back row was Barron Trump. He hadn't drawn attention to himself until now. With whispers growing louder, Barron knew this wasn't a moment for silence. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. The flight was supposed to be a routine one, a full cabin, passengers finding their seats, overhead compartments being stuffed, and the usual pre-flight announcements. However, there was a somber air about this particular flight. Before boarding began, something unusual took place. A line of soldiers in full uniform stood silently on the tarmac, saluting as a flag-draped casket was carefully carried toward the plane's cargo hold. Inside the terminal, several passengers noticed the ceremony outside. Some remained silent out of respect, while others seemed indifferent, more focused on their travel plans than the solemn event unfolding before them. As the casket was loaded, whispers began to circulate among those waiting to board. "Must be a fallen soldier," someone quietly remarked. A few travelers nodded in understanding, while others barely gave it a second glance, too distracted by their phones or conversations. Once the casket was secured, boarding began as usual. Families with small children, priority passengers, and military personnel were the first to enter the plane. Among them was a quiet young boy, Barron Trump, accompanied by a small security detail. Despite his notable presence, Barron appeared calm and unobtrusive, finding his seat near the front of the cabin without drawing attention. As the rest of the passengers filed in, some grumbled about delays. "Why is it taking so long?" a man in a suit muttered under his breath, clearly irritated. Another woman sighed heavily as she struggled to find room for her carry-on. It seemed not everyone was aware or cared about the solemn event outside moments earlier. Amid the bustle of passengers settling in, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, requesting a moment of silence to honor the fallen soldier whose casket they were carrying on board. While many bowed their heads respectfully, a few passengers rolled their eyes or shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly displeased by what they saw as an unnecessary delay. They didn't realize that this flight was about to become anything but ordinary. Unbeknownst to those restless and impatient travelers, what would happen next would leave everyone on board stunned and reflective. But for now, the flight was ready for takeoff, carrying not just ordinary passengers, but also the memory of a soldier who had given his all for his country. As the flight ascended into the skies, a few passengers couldn't hide their annoyance over the earlier delay caused by the fallen soldier's casket. Most passengers sat quietly, reflecting on the moment of silence, or simply relaxing into their seats. However, a few didn't share the same sentiment. Seated near the front of the cabin, a man in a crisp business suit leaned toward his companion and muttered, "I didn't pay for a first-class ticket to sit through unnecessary ceremonies." His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for those nearby to hear, causing a few uncomfortable glances in his direction. "I get it, respect the dead, but this is just too much," whispered a woman seated a few rows behind. She adjusted her neck pillow with an annoyed expression, clearly displeased. "It's a plane, not a funeral home," she added, as though her travel time was somehow more important than the honor being shown to a fallen soldier. Barron Trump, quietly seated at the front, overheard the comments. He shifted slightly, his expression remaining calm but focused. He had learned from his parents the importance of dignity and respect, especially in such moments. Though he remained silent for now, those disrespectful remarks didn't sit well with him. He could feel the tension growing in the cabin, an uneasy divide between those who showed reverence for the soldier's sacrifice and those who were too self-absorbed to care. The murmurs didn't stop there. Another passenger, a man in his mid-40s, shook his head and sighed loudly, clearly wanting to draw attention. "I don't see why we all had to be delayed. Couldn't they have done that without holding everyone up?" His words drew a few nods of agreement from similarly irritable travelers. It was clear that respect and patience weren't universal on this flight. Yet amidst the complaints, there were passengers who remained quiet, disapproving of the disrespect but unwilling to confront it. The mood in the cabin grew tense. It wasn't just a regular flight anymore. It had become a silent conflict between those who valued honor and those who couldn't be bothered. What happened next would make it impossible for anyone to ignore the gravity of the situation. As the complaints continued, an uneasy tension spread throughout the cabin. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to step in or let things be. A family sitting near the middle of the plane whispered to each other, casting disapproving looks at the loudest complainers. A teenager in the window seat took out his phone, pretending to scroll through it but clearly listening to the rising murmurs around him. The mood became heavier with each passing moment. It wasn't just the disrespectful remarks, it was the way they echoed through the cabin, turning what should have been a solemn, reflective journey into a divisive experience. Even the flight attendants noticed the change in atmosphere. They moved quietly, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. But the tension was hard to ignore. Barron Trump, sitting quietly near the front, observed everything with sharp eyes. He noticed how a few passengers tried to remain respectful despite the complaints, their silence speaking volumes. He also saw how the disrespectful remarks seemed to embolden others who might have stayed quiet otherwise. It wasn't just about one fallen soldier anymore. It was about how easily some people could forget the value of sacrifice when it inconvenienced them. A particularly loud sigh from a man in business attire broke through the low murmurs. "Honestly, how long do we have to sit in this tense atmosphere?" he said with a pointed look toward a flight attendant. His words hung in the air, making the already charged atmosphere even worse. Still, no one directly confronted the complainers. It was as though everyone waited for someone else to say something. Passengers who valued respect didn't want to escalate the situation, while those annoyed by the delay continued to air their grievances. The divide grew wider and the tension more palpable. Barron's eyes flicked toward the back of the plane, where an elderly couple sat quietly, their hands clasped together. He could see their discomfort. Something had to be done. This flight was supposed to honor a fallen hero, not descend into bickering and selfishness. Though he remained silent for now, Barron knew it wouldn't be for long. Barron Trump sat in silence for as long as he could, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had been raised to respect moments like this, to understand that honor and dignity are more important than personal comfort. But as the disrespectful remarks continued, something inside him stirred. He couldn't just sit there anymore while people insulted the sacrifice of a fallen soldier. With a calm yet determined expression, Barron unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly stood up. His tall frame made him instantly noticeable, and soon heads began to turn. The murmuring died down slightly as people noticed that someone was about to speak. There was a moment of tense silence, as if the entire plane was waiting to see what would happen next. Barron cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, everyone," he began, his tone calm but carrying a weight of seriousness that demanded attention. "I understand that this delay is inconvenient for many of you, but right now we're in the presence of something far more important than schedules and personal plans." His words hung in the air, and passengers leaned forward slightly, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. Even the most vocal complainers quieted down, surprised by the unexpected speaker. Barron continued, his eyes scanning the cabin. "We are sharing this flight with someone who gave everything so that we can live in peace and freedom. That soldier didn't complain when duty called. He didn't put his comfort first. He answered the call to serve." A few passengers lowered their gazes, feeling the weight of Barron's words. The elderly couple near the back nodded silently in approval. Barron took a deep breath, steadying himself before finishing. I know we're all eager to get to our destinations, but I ask you, just for a moment, let's honor this fallen hero. Let's show a little respect for someone who can no longer speak for himself. The plane grew eerily quiet. No more whispers, no more sighs of frustration. There was only silence, the kind that forces people to reflect on themselves. Barron sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't planned to stand up and speak, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And as he glanced around, he noticed something different, something that made the tense atmosphere shift. Respect had returned. As Barron sat back down, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted almost immediately. The defiant murmurs that had filled the air moments before were replaced with an unsettling silence. People exchanged glances, some out of guilt, others out of newfound respect. It was as if Barron's words had touched something deep within them, something they hadn't realized was missing in their earlier frustration. The elderly couple at the back, who had initially seemed indifferent, were now nodding in approval. A few passengers looked down at their hands, avoiding eye contact with others. It was clear they felt a sense of discomfort. One man, who had been one of the loudest complainers, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between the soldier's casket and the people around him. A woman across the aisle, who had been muttering about the inconvenience, suddenly turned to her seatmate and whispered an apology. I didn't realize, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Another passenger, a middle-aged man who had been fidgeting nervously, cleared his throat before speaking up. You're right, he said, his voice softer than it had been before. I've been sitting here complaining about my flight when there are bigger things at play. The man next to him, who had been similarly agitated, nodded in agreement. We're all just trying to get where we're going, but, yeah, I get it now. That soldier gave up more than I'll ever understand. Around the cabin, more passengers began to speak in hushed tones, acknowledging the weight of the moment. Even those who hadn't said a word before now seemed more aware of the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, but it was different now, calmer, reflective. A sense of unity had begun to replace the frustration. The flight attendants, who had been watching the exchange, exchanged looks of surprise. They could sense the change in the cabin. Passengers who had once been annoyed now appeared to be reconsidering their attitudes. It was as if the simple act of speaking out had reminded them of the things that truly mattered. The flight, while still delayed, now carried a different weight, a weight that transcended mere inconvenience. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers, once divided by complaints and frustration, now shared a silent understanding. Barron's words had sparked a moment of reflection that brought a shift in perspective. The discomfort, the anger, and the tension had melted away, replaced by a collective respect for the fallen soldier. In that quiet, transformative moment, they had all been reminded of what truly matters: sacrifice, honor, and unity. If you were moved by Barron's powerful gesture and want to see more stories that inspire, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Let's spread respect, honor, and unity together.